Sairam students, welcome back. Today we are going to learn history chapter sources of history. This is our revision session. So let's see the introduction of the lesson. A number of objects used by our ancestors and some inscriptions from past still exist. These sources help us to understand history. This means students, the sources help us to understand history with a number of objects used by our ancestors and some inscriptions from past still exist. Okay. Now the next, the customs and traditions, folk literature and historical documents help us to understand history. Okay. Means folk literature, customs, traditions and historical documents help us to understand history. Okay. Next, all these are known as the sources of history. These sources are material sources, written sources, oral sources. Okay, this means all these are known as sources of history. And the sources are, which are the sources? Material sources, written sources, oral sources. There are how many sources? 3 sources. Material sources, written sources and oral sources. Okay. Now we will see material sources. The artifacts, articles, monuments or their remains are called material sources of history. For example, pottery, beads, coins, caves, etc. This means students, artifacts. Artifacts means an object made by a person known as artifacts. So artifacts and articles and monuments or their remains. Their remains means the remains of the monument or articles are called material sources of history. For example, pottery, beads, coins, caves, etc. Okay. Now the next picture of material sources. So coins and ornaments are material sources. Next is written sources. In the Stone Age, people have recorded events and expressed emotions in paintings on rocks. Later, man used symbols and signs to record thoughts. Means later on, man had used symbols and signs to record his thoughts. And in the Stone Age, people have recorded events and expressed emotion in paintings on rocks. Okay. Now next. Thousands of years later, script was developed. In the beginning, man wrote on potsherds, unbaked bricks by using pointed objects. He also used bhujapatra, bark of birch tree, to write. This means students, later scripts has been developed thousands of years ago. And in the beginning, man wrote on the potsherds, unbaked bricks by using pointed objects. Okay. And he also used bhujapatra, that was bark of birch tree, to write the written sources. Okay. Next, as man's knowledge and experience increased, he began to use various forms of writing. The proceedings in the royal courts were recorded in writing. The edicts, decrees, and deeds of kings were inscribed on stone or copper plates. This means students, the proceeding in the royal courts were recorded in writing in those period, because as man's knowledge and experience were also increased, he began to use various forms of writing. The edicts. Edicts means official announcement made of law. Then decrees. Decrees means law. And deeds of kings were inscribed on stone or copper plates. Okay. Next, different forms of literature such as poems, plays, travelogues, and scientific writings developed. All this together form the written sources of history. So, what happened afterwards? Different forms of literature such as poems, plays, travelogues, and even scientific writings were developed, and all this together form the written source of history. Okay, so you can see this is a copper plate. Okay, and this is an inscription on a rock. Okay, now the next is oral sources. OVs, folk songs, folk tales, and similar literature are passed on from generation to generation by word of mouth. The authors of this unwritten literature is unknown. Literature preserved by oral tradition is the oral sources of history. This means, students, the OVs or folk songs, folk tales, and even similar literatures are passed on from one generation to the other generation by word of mouth, means by oral way. Okay, then the authors of this were unknown. Okay, then literature is preserved by oral tradition is the oral sources of history. Okay, now the next sources of ancient Indian history. The ancient period of Indian history extends from the Stone Age to the 8th century CE. This means, students, the Stone Age to the 8th century CE, the ancient period of Indian history extended. Okay. Now the next information about the ancient period from 1500 BCE onward can be derived from Vedic literature. So, the information about the ancient period from 1500 BCE onwards can be derived from the Vedic literature. Okay. In the beginning, the Vedas were not in the written form. Okay. The ancient Indians had developed the technique of memorizing and reciting them. This means, students, in previous days or in the ancient period, in the beginning of the Vedas, were not in the written form. But the ancient Indians had developed the technique of memorizing and reciting them. Okay. Next, the Veda were written down later on. The Vedas and the post-Vedic literature form an important source of ancient Indian history. Okay, means the Vedas and the post-Vedic literature form an important source of ancient Indian history because the Veda were written down later on. Okay. We have a large number of material, written and oral sources of Indian history. Okay, we have large number of material, written and oral sources of Indian history. Now the next point we are going to see is precautions to be taken while writing history. A written document cannot be said to be authentic just because it is old. It needs to be examined critically as to who wrote it, why and when it was written. Students, authentic means real. So a written document cannot be said to be real just because it is old, and it has the need to be examined critically as who wrote it, why he wrote and when it was written. Okay, now the next. The conclusions drawn on the basis of various genuine documents have to be cross-checked and corroborated with one another. This means, students, at the end we have to cross-check the supporting evidence with one another before writing history. Okay. Now what we have learned? We have learned today introduction, then material sources, written sources, oral sources, sources of ancient history, precautions to be taken while writing history. Okay. Now we will see the activity. What will you do when the following situations arise? First, you have found an old coin. The options are A. Keep it with yourself. B. Give it to a museum. C. Give it to your parents. So, what will you do? Yes, it will be B. Give it to a museum. Okay. Now the next. When you visit a museum, what will you do when you visit a museum? A. Will handle article in the museum. B. Will collect information about articles. C. Will play on the lawn in front of the museum. Yes, students, what will you do? Yes? Yes, it will be B. Will collect information about articles. Okay. Now the next. State whether the following statements are true or false. The information acquired by word of mouth is a written source of history. A true, B false. What will be the answer? Yes, false. Second, man used stone as well as metal plates for writing. Yes, A true, B false. A true. Very good. Next, the cave paintings are a part of written source of history. A true, B false. False. Very good. That's all for today. Sairam, thank you.